Are you guys holding up okay though? Personally, just hanging around the house.
What do you guys miss the most? Honestly, like woke hats off. Like whatever. Like what do you guys miss the most?
Movie theaters, easy.
Yeah, that's a good one. Are you not? It's just different, right? Than streaming.
Different.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a movie theater experience. It's real.
Seeing people in real life.
Yeah, that too. You know, Greg, I miss going on your boat, Greg.
Oh,
I'm
that's
sad you
nice.
guys couldn't
I
go
miss
on the
having
boat.
you guys over. That's the main reason I have this podcast is to invite people over to the boat and like serve them like snacks and drinks and things.
Well, you like really have a boat? Like, do you live on the boat?
Yeah, I live on my sailboat where we record the podcast when there's not a global pandemic on.
Yeah.
And the main thing that keeps me interested is having guests over. I would have loved to have you guys over. We'd have had some.
Wait, I've been on your guys'
food.
podcast before, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We forgot
Which
to mention.
I never was on a boat.
We were recording
No
at
perks.
Alex's place way back in the day. That was super early. And
see, I was an OG guest.
No, you were. You were the original guest. You're the first guest ever on Seattle Sucks.
No, shut up.
Damn.
That's right. That's right. You heard that? I didn't even get boat privileges.
Yeah.
Well,
I was shocked you haven't been on the boat. Yeah, you have to come back. Both of you have to come back on.
You got to come back. Come on the boat.
When the boat's available.
You know, you'll be invited to this summer's Seattle Sucks cruise, virus dependent.
Oh, hell yeah.
Come back for another episode.
It's going to be a Zoom meeting.
no. Hopefully at some point we will take this out on the lake with a bunch of people and you guys should come. But
that's dope. I just restarted. I restarted Arrested Development.
Nice.
And I'm just imagining the Bluth boat right now.
Oh yeah.
Scale it down quite a bit.
It's more homey.
But it's still pouring down your banana stand.
It's very classy. Was just a little smaller and more homey, and it has sails.
Oh, cool.
But yeah. So you guys have definitely.
Welcome back to Seattle Sucks, a podcast about hating the city we love. We're here again, remotely, with some guests.
Yeah, an unprecedented pandemic, an unfolding economic depression. Here in Seattle, like everywhere, the underlying iniquities of our society are being laid bare before the eyes of anyone who cares to look upon them. We've mentioned on this show, Seattle has a massive chronic housing and homelessness disaster ongoing. Crisis is exacerbating that. I think would be accepted as a priori in these parts, but we don't have to be so customarily glib tonight because we've got with us via a free web service that is
I think
holding
it's
together
still
so far.
messed up.
Yeah.
It was working, and then it died.
Oh, it's the boat, man.
It's
The
cursed.
sea claims another one. So Greg has internet through the marina he's docked at, and I think that is the issue we're having.
Yeah, it's okay. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Do you live in a boat?
Yeah.
Oh, I can hear you
great.
now.
Yeah, Greg's a man of the sea.
Oh, that's awesome.
So we have with us Shik Kim Jr. and Guy Oron, two Seattle-based
Hello.
journalists with national bylines who have actually done the work, the research, and the reporting on our city's continually punitive response against the homeless population, even in the time of Corona. Their latest in the nation is called Seattle Destroyed Homeless Encampments as the Pandemic Raged. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're super excited to talk about these very uplifting stories of the sort of brutal denigration of the most helpless and marginalized in our society. And hey, we're not even necessarily talking about coronavirus.
Yeah.
What was the genesis of this reporting in particular? Was this something that you guys started working on just as in, I guess, early March when it was shown, as you showed here, that the navigation teams were still rousting people even like after a state of emergency was declared?
Yeah. So I would say that for me, we had both written and done research about sweeps and homelessness for years. But for me, both me and Day saw like on social media that sweeps were still happening like weeks after the governor, Jay Inslee, had declared a state of emergency on COVID-19. And so we were like, we need to speak out. We need to talk about this. And so that's why we wanted to write a piece for a national outlet so we could maybe make some impact on the conversation and make sure people are aware like sweeps were happening during a pandemic and making things so much worse.
Yeah, and the sweeps were a continuation of a policy happening before the pandemic, right?
Yeah. I would say they were already quite harmful. Like every direct service provider, unhoused person we talked to did not support them in the first place. Basically, what happens is that the navigation team, which is composed of police officers and social workers, go to an encampment and they can do it. And they basically can take people's belongings away or destroy them and basically force them to move. And so it was already a quite harmful practice before COVID-19, but then since everyone needs to practice social distancing, it just makes everything worse because people are forced to crowd together in shelters or in other locations, and so that it really can endanger people's lives.
Well, maybe you can give us like more of a background in the navigation teams and their tactics and what sort of that program and just the city's response in general has actually meant even before this crisis, so we kind of have an understanding of like what was going on, because it's not, it's not something you can just sort of look at face value and say, oh, the navigation teams are like people who go out and help the homeless, like the city would have you believe, connect people up with services, find them shelters, and their written rules, we know, like don't necessarily mean anything. So can you give us a bit more of a background in that?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. Guy made this graph that didn't quite get into our piece, but it's a graph about comparing the sweeps that are given 72-hour notice and the sweeps aren't. And why that's important and why I'm bringing that up to answer your question is because the people who show up, to put it simply, to a homeless encampment removal or sweeps is really dependent on whether it falls into either category. And so the encampments that get posted with a 72-hour warning are the social services and caseworkers show up to those sweeps. And they're helping navigate the residents of the encampment, the homeless individuals, and they're there to help them literally navigate as a navigation team to shelter options, to resources, to make sure the people who have to get their stuff stored in storage know how to obtain their stuff after the removal happens. But if the city deems an encampment an obstruction or a hazard or an extreme circumstance, or it's in an emphasis zone, then the social workers, that part of the navigation team, is no longer required to be there. And that has been the majority of the homeless sweeps, at least the past couple of years, especially in 2019. And we've seen those happen even during the coronavirus epidemic.
Yeah, and so the 72-hour notice was passed by the city, right, in order to try and make the sweeps that have been happening for years more humane. But you guys mentioned that it wasn't just that the no-notice sweeps were the majority. They were the vast majority of sweeps last year, right?
Yes. So, yeah, I could also give a little bit more background on the navigation team. So the city has been conducting sweeps for at least 5 years, even before the city declared a state of emergency on homelessness. After it did so, it initially used different departments until in 2017 they formalized this navigation team. That's kind of the squad that removes people at like a more efficient rate. And so this navigation team in 2017, they implemented those rules, but they still have this huge loophole where if an encampment is classified as an obstruction, it can just be swept with no notice and no outreach or referrals to shelter required. And so what's happened is that about 93% of the sweeps in 2019 were just obstruction or hazard or these non 72-hour notice sweeps, which is what we've seen. And this is a very intentional strategy by the city because sweeps are ultimately more about the aesthetic of homelessness and making sure that housed neighbors don't have to see their unhoused neighbors. And so this is like the issue we're dealing with is that before the coronavirus even started here, it was already, we were in a situation of more and more like punitive, escalating punitive response from the city.
Yeah, and this is a city, right, where you mentioned the article, the amount of people that are experiencing homelessness has gone up pretty much every year since 2012, which would seem paradoxical given maybe our middle school education and economics, because the city's also seen quite an economic boom in that time, right? Yet somehow we still have this growing homeless population. How does that work?
Yeah, I don't want to oversimplify the homelessness crisis that we have, and to remind the listeners, this has been a state of emergency declared in 2015. So it's been a little while, and like you mentioned, growing worse every year. I think, again, not to oversimplify it, but it comes down to, is the city or the people in leadership willing to build affordable housing? And I think when you look at Mayor Durkin's trajectory thus far in her mayorship, and the decisions she's making, we see corporations willing to build temporary shelters, a little by little. Amazon buying Mary's Place for a good press release here and there, but still not enough investment in affordable housing. And we see the studies that show that that is literally the only thing that's going to really level out this crisis. Until we see that happening, I don't know how else to put it other than the city is just not investing in certain type of people and demographics to stay in the city long term. It's just not, they're not building a city for them, for the working class. And we see those medium income affecting the housing prices. We see people getting priced out of their neighborhoods. We see neighborhoods looking less and less like it did just a couple years ago. And we're going to continue to see that happening unless we have elected leaders in those seats that are investing in the type of housing that the working class and Black and Brown communities can actually afford and live in.
Yeah. And to add to this is a structural issue of neoliberalism, really, where sort of neoliberalism kind of denigrated the inner city as slums or as ghettos. And so using that as a justification to remove public housing and remove all these safety nets for primarily Black and brown people. And then you have the foreclosure crisis, of course, which left a lot of people without their homes. And on top of that, now in Seattle, for the past 10 years, we've seen such a big economic boom, but it's all the gains are concentrated at the top, mostly the 1% and tech workers and people who can fit into that class. And so that has left so many people behind. And the city has just not stood up to the challenge and often actually worked counterproductively, I would say. And so the number one thing, like Day mentioned, is getting more publicly owned affordable housing, as well as the city could have, over the past 4 years, done much better to create temporary shelters that can save lives. Last year, the city passed an ordinance sanctioning 40 new tent cities, like sanctioned encampments, as well as shelters. Yet no funding has yet materialized for that. And we've seen this has been a huge detriment during the COVID-19 crisis, where the city wasn't prepared really to deal with homelessness. And so now unhoused people who are at so much more risk for catching the virus.
Yeah, and and this is the McKinsey study that you were citing in the piece, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that has a similar ring to it as the from, I guess, last year or the year before, maybe, the Chamber of Commerce's study that basically just again, from this a corporate lobby essentially just admitting we just need to spend more money on housing. So it seems like that's pretty much understood across the board. Yeah.
Yes, I would say that the facts are pretty clear. There are still people out there who will say we have enough money to spend, which I don't believe is the case. The city does need to raise a lot more money for housing if it really wants to deal with the crisis.
But it's not doing that. It's choosing the stick instead. Trying to criminalize and sort of punish people in the hope that, I guess, let's maybe talk about, like, what do you guys, having sort of gone down this rabbit hole for so long, talked to people in the city, done this reporting, been on this issue for so long, like, what is at the level of the city, like, what do they really believe when we don't have the money being allocated, but we do have this sort of navigation team, sort of shell game, like, where you have the navigation team is a really interesting thing, because it's like they'll say, as you were describing, that on the one hand there's the version of the navigation team that gives warning and comes out with social workers, etc. And then there's one that's just the cops show up and roust you, but they say it's all part of the same thing, the navigation team. Pretty suspicious. It's almost like they're two completely different things, and one is a cover for the other. So, like, what do we think? What do the people in power, like, really? I mean, what is their concept of this, and how do they justify to themselves this sort of punitive approach in the absence of anything else?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's long term for them at all.
Yeah.
I have been at many encampments during sweeps, and I've heard police officers and city workers say that hopefully, if they continue to sweep a certain area enough times, the people at the encampments will be tired and stop coming back. It's a tactic of who's gonna bend first, right? And I wish I had that in recording, or some body cam footage of the cop saying that, or I would have made it into my story, but it's definitely good enough for Seattle Sucks podcast.
But well said.
But
no, it absolutely is. No, I mean, that's
but I will say, but I mean, it is, and I've heard it multiple times, and I don't mind going on record saying that is the type of language that's being said, and that not only do I hear this, the people at the encampments hear this.
Yeah.
When you see body cam footage of police officers rolling up to an encampment, and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, who has a warrant? Who has a warrant? Show me your warrants. I'm going to look it up. What's your name? Let's see if you have warrants.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's completely bullying. It's a bullying tactic, and it's to scare the people out of their homes, into just freaking them out, and most of them don't know the rights. But on the flip side, actually, a lot of them do know the policies of an encampment removal more and more.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that these 72-hour notices are going away every month. And it came to a point where the people at the encampments knew that if they kept their place clean, if they were away from these major hazards laid out by the city, that the city had no jurisdiction or no rights to remove their encampment.
Yeah.
And so we built up a system to the point where the people living at these encampments had trash systems in place. They had a process where they knew what days the encampment removal people were coming. They knew what to do, and they knew the questions to ask. And I think the city caught on to that and are starting to get rid of that altogether. Because when go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, when the city kind of figured that out, and the people living at these encampments figured out ways to combat the narrative that the city was trying to portray, the city had no choice but to flip the 72-hour encampment removals into day of encampment removals, where they're catching people off guard, where they're not giving enough warning, where they're not required to provide shelter beds because they know shelter spaces were limited.
Yeah. And that begs like an important question, I think, because like it's easy enough to imagine like some cops, thinking of this as just like, rousting these marginalized people and making them go away, and sort of, would not surprise anyone that you're the cops in SPD have like a simplistic view like that, and an antagonistic one. But we've heard the same, like a different version, but just as chilling, maybe more so, language from the mayor herself. The phrase like "clean and hold," I think, rings in my memory, which
Mm-hmm.
is basically like treating homeless encampments or areas where people set up tents as like strategic hamlets in a counterinsurgency doctrine war, like the language of actually declaring war on these people, that they just need to be defeated and go away. So my question then is, when this creep happens, when this creep from the 72 hours to, oh, now we're, using the provisions that were built into the law, and the regulations to say, oh, we can show up the day of and clear you because you're supposedly an obstruction. Do we have a sense of whether that is mostly just SPD like taking its own initiative, and sort of a sort of bureaucratic drift at the bottom end there, or is this like coming from the mayor's office? Do we have any way of knowing this or guessing?
I don't know if we are able to know for sure, 100%. Erica C. Burnett did report back in May that the mayor's office was the one who was pushing for more obstruction sweeps. And basically,
Really?
it's really an aesthetic desire to make sure that the people who are complaining about unhoused encampments don't see them anymore. They don't want to
Yeah,
see.
you're referring to the people who matter.
Oh, yeah, like oftentimes people call them NIMBYs, right? Not in my
Yeah.
backyard. The stereotypical, like, wealthier, whiter, suburban kind of type of people who make up a significant amount of Seattle. And so they're the ones who really drive a lot of the sweeps, where when they complain to the city, and they reported on this, I think, a year ago, through an app, they can actually basically facilitate the city then going to the encampments and sweeping them. And so, yeah, and I also want to touch, there is this sort of logic of saviorism, or like savior logic, where Mayor Jenny Durkin and others have said, like, they're doing this for the health of homeless people. They're justifying sweeping people by saying that these encampments are super unsafe and unsanitary. And it's true, a lot of these places do have big issues, but they're really weaponizing the fact that unhoused people are just trying to get by and trying to survive, and using these encampments as a justification to sweep them. And I think, like they said, they're borrowing this language of criminalization, where homeless people become a criminalized caste, essentially, that the city can do whatever they want, basically, to. And so by sleeping on public land that, these homeless people are entitled to, since they're residents of the city, and so they're part of the public. But that becomes another justification, sort of the carceral logic of deterrence that has criminalized so many Black and brown people, and unhoused people are also disproportionately Black, brown, and Indigenous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that brings up a interesting. I was going to say that brings up sort of an interesting point, right? Where we talked with a historian a couple of weeks ago, right? And she was talking about the town of Shacktown in Seattle, which was just essentially a large working poor encampment in Seattle in the Progressive era. And they, at that time too, they used the sanitation logic for burning their houses to the ground, right? Yet nobody ever asked the question, right, of, okay, you're burning it down because it's unsanitary, but what next for these people, right? Similarly, this idea of criminalizing the homeless, so therefore I'm going to remove them from this neighborhood, but there's no question of like, well, where do they go? Like, we never seem to finish that thought, right? It's unsanitary, they have to go. but how did destroying their house help that situation? You know what I mean? Like, how come we never get why do we never get to that next question of what's next after we remove these people?
Well, I think that's the main goal. The main goal of the navigation team isn't to do outreach or to get people in housing. It's to remove these encampments. And like one of you said, the sort of social services side becomes this shield to hide really the policing aspect of sweeps. And I think it's great that you mentioned, Brian, this history, because this isn't something new. This is very deep in Seattle. Really, in the first colonization sort of era in the 1850s was when we saw the first kind of wave of displacement. And so Duwamish and other indigenous people lost their homes. Oftentimes settlers would burn their houses. And so this sort of traumatic legacy of like continually pushing out certain groups of people, either through economic means or direct violence, is still represented here today. And so we see that coming back, cycling back again and again throughout many eras of this city's history.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, and maybe you can expand this a little bit, but in your article, you even mentioned that Native people remain, disproportionately homeless in this city. And many of us will remember in 2011, I believe it was, when John T. Williams, who was a, occasionally homeless Native American woodcarver, was murdered in broad daylight by a Seattle police officer during rush hour downtown. And essentially nothing happened, right? Maybe speak a little more about how this, some of these disenfranchised communities are especially affected by this problem.
Yeah, I mean, people who are on the streets are disproportionately disabled and have and are disproportionately Black, Brown, and Indigenous because our economic system is built on sort of disenfranchising, like you said, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And so we see people on the streets like John T. Williams and others sort of at the intersection of multiple harmful like state systems. And so I think that's a big issue for Seattle, is that if it really wants to practice racial equity, it needs to not make sweeps better, but just stop them.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you guys a question, is if we should organize unhoused folks to take over public housing as squatting efforts, or Airbnb or hotel?
There's so many choices.
I think San Francisco and Vegas together has about 190,000 vacant hotel rooms right now. Amazing. I want to say. And did you see those lots that they're forcing the unhoused folks to be in? The parking lot
with the lines painted on the
ground, with the painted out lines
6 feet apart, laying on the pavement. Absolutely disgusting.
And I can't even imagine how many B&Bs. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, we saw the city buy a hotel in White Center, right, to put people in quarantine. They just bought a defunct nursing home that has, I think, 160 rooms in it. Again, for quarantine and things like that. They blocked out 500 rooms in a hotel downtown for quarantine workers. Yet again and again, we constantly hear this. We just can't build, we can't get any sort of long-term facilities or long-term housing together for homeless people. So, what does that tell us when on a dime they seem to be able to do it for literally anybody else?
Right. I mean, the question is, I don't know if you made it to the end of our very long piece in The Nation. I'm surprised he let us publish 3,000 words. By the way, it's the longest shit I've ever written. But at the end, the ACLU attorney, Breanne Schuster, said or told us that she's very curious to see, there's different measures that the city is taking to at least appear that they care about the homeless community in our city. They're trying to build more shelter space. They're stopping the sweeps. And what are they going to continue to do, or what are they going to continue not to do when this pandemic at least slows down and the curve flattens out a little bit more? When I was talking to the folks at the Ballard encampment a couple weeks ago, they told me that the bike cops did indeed visit their encampment and let them know that they're going to be swept the following morning. All this is happening after the city, quote unquote, announced that the sweeps have stopped temporarily through this pandemic. And the next morning, those bike cops showed up and let them know that that indeed that the mayor told them that they're not allowed to sweep right now, but they'll be back in a couple weeks. So be ready.
Yeah, I mean, let's pause on that for a second, because I mean, that when we talk about the sort of cruelty of SPD and the sort of mindset of SPD, I thought that in your article kind of spelled it out perfectly. So, the city basically said, we're not going to do any more encampment sweeps. What was it that day? The Pike police or these cops were over at Ballard Public Library telling people in encampment that they're going to sweep them. And then the next morning they came back, right, and said, well, we can't do it right now. We're coming back the second we can. Is that correct?
Yeah, they literally gave a timeline like, hey, we'll be back next week, but maybe we won't be able to by then, but definitely in 2 weeks, which is coming up. So I need to go and check. By the way, that encampment, unfortunately, has not received and maybe they have, unless it happened a couple of days ago, but the last time I checked, they have not received the how do you say it? The sanitization stations.
The sanitation stations.
Yeah, sanitation. Yeah, exactly.
As of a year ago.
Yeah, from Durkin, that has not happened, and now there is a Hep A outbreak there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are the ones who were told by the bike cops. By the way, I do want to mention that the North Precinct bike cops are some of the worst among SPD. They're the same precinct that's been fighting for that hundreds of $1 million police bunker that keeps getting shut down. Yeah. So they're definitely not the happiest group of cops. They love the over militarization of policing. They're all for it. And they are continuing to push Durkin and Juarez. Yeah. Our good friend, Deborah. And pushing for that bunker. So yeah, that's the precinct that loves to go around on their bikes. They go to Ravenna, they go to Ballard. I know them very well. I've watched hours of their body cam footage. I know how each of them sound like. And so they're the ones going up to these encampments, and I don't know if they're either lying to them and trying to hopefully scare them out of there without actually doing the sweeps. Right. I agree with that too. But I guess they could be misinformed and finding out information a little late. But either way, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Thankfully, they didn't conduct a sweep. But at the same time, I don't think they would have had the resources to perform a sweep even if they wanted to, because the city paused them. So we'll see what happens in a week or two. I know Inslee extended the stay-at-home order till May 5th. I'm not totally sure if that counts for removing encampments, but we're going to have to check.
Well, it's whatever policy the city sets ultimately, but it's interesting. I do think this is really like this sort of incident that you talk about in the piece. Actually, I'll just read it here. I think it says earlier in the piece that it's the 17th was the day the order came down to stop the sweeps, and that it was the night of March 19th. You guys write North Seattle. Seattle North Precinct police officers approached a 510 encampment at the Ballard branch of the Seattle Public Library, which was already closed due to pandemic. And the officers told residents they had to either vacate the area or be forcibly removed the following morning. And you quote one of the residents, "To be honest, I was surprised they gave us all till the next morning," a resident named Paul told The Nation. "They used to just come during the mornings and sweep us around 8 a.m., but not anymore. Now they do it at all times of day. I got swept at 2 a.m. last time and didn't know what to do." And what's interesting, what he's saying, he's surprised he's getting this warning at all, because what had developed from, it sounds like what has developed, right, is from this initial sort of paradigm of the supposed navigation teams giving people notice and then trying to connect them with services 72 hours later, to SPD at someone's direction, exploiting the regulation of classic poverty criminalization, of exploiting obstruction laws and stuff to come and rouse these people at any time with no warning, to scare them off and get rid of them. And now the progression, once that came down from the city, it sounds very much like they rolled up on these people full well knowing that they had no right under their own orders from the city to sweep them, to ask them to leave under the sort of order because of coronavirus. but we're just trying to scare them off. We're lying to them. And then the residents here called their bluff the next morning. So the question then is like, is this now what is going on now? Are they rolling around everywhere? And how many people have they scared off who hightailed it to somewhere else in the middle of the night for fear of being swept the next morning, you know?
Yeah, a couple weeks before I wouldn't say a couple weeks, I would say maybe like a week before the ballot encampment, I was driving around um, on the hunt for the cops. It's so funny, a couple of encampments I arrived at, I saw some police officers there, obviously conducting a sweep, and then immediately seeing them drive away. Have you ever had police officers run away from you?
No, but that must be a fucking
That's not an
awesome
experience
feeling.
I've had, though.
Yeah, no, it literally happened to me when I was under Soto Bridge by Airport Way, around the place where a gentleman named Alex got swept not too long ago after the state of emergency NC declared, during the time where it's already very clearly known coronavirus is a thing. It's affecting people. And I was just looking for the place where he got swept, because I was supposed to meet him around there to help him out and also see if there were other encampments there that were getting affected by the navigation team, the police officers, the city. I arrived at this encampment. Sure enough, two cops in their patrol car on the side of the road and a city truck loading some of the items in the encampment into the truck. And it seems like they must have got there maybe 20, 30 minutes before I did. I got to the encampment. I made it very known that I was there. I didn't want to spook the cops. The last thing you want to do is startle police officers. And so they saw me. I told them I was wondering what happened to Alex, if they're still doing the sweep. This was a day or two after Mike Fong, the deputy mayor, got completely annihilated in a city council briefing. And this was a day after the city put out their first statement saying that all scheduled sweeps stop unless it's an extreme hazard. And so I was there and I asked them if they're doing a sweep and if this sweep counted as an extreme hazard. And the officers quickly told me a sweep was not happening, that they're just here for resources and that's it. And I was like, okay, that's cool. That's good to know. I asked if I could talk to anybody else. They brought over one of the city workers. The city workers had no answers for me. It was very strange. The officers then told me that they called in their sergeant to come in and talk to me, and he'll be there in 5 to 10 minutes. So I said, okay, that's fine. I thought was a little strange that a police sergeant was coming all the way down to this encampment to talk to me. A couple minutes later, the police officers told me that the sergeant was actually too busy now and changed his mind and wasn't coming, but gave me the number to the city that to a person that I could possibly talk to get my questions answered. I said, okay, that's fine. I asked if I could talk to one of the residents because I saw somebody enter their tent at the encampment. They told me that's fine. As soon as I walked over there, I asked the person in their tent if they got any notice of removal, and they told me that a couple days before they got posted for a sweep, and that today was the day that I was there. They were supposed to get swept, and they're actually cleaning up all their stuff, preparing to get swept. And I asked a couple of his neighbors who were also in their tents, and they confirmed that they also got notices. And as I was talking to them, these cops got in their car and drove away, and the city truck left too. So nothing happened. I continued to go to that encampment the days following, and they seemed untouched. And I gave them my phone number and I told them to call me if they came back and try to do the sweep, because I let them know that the city put an order to pause all sweeps until this pandemic was over. But it was crazy. It was crazy seeing the cops hightail out of there and really have no answers to me. They told me that they weren't doing a sweep, but they were just giving out resources. I asked the people at the encampment, they said they didn't receive anything. No water, no wipes, nothing. Not even a flyer to ask them to wash their hands.
This was, you're saying, the day after, I guess, the 18th, the day after?
Yeah,
they
around the 18th, 19th.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it sounds like they posted, this sweep notice before the city announced it was canceling the sweeps. And
yeah,
the navigation team or the cops decided, well, I mean, we already posted this one. I guess we're going to go out and do it, even though,
I mean, it was weird. They're like, oh, we're there passing out resources, but all I saw the city workers doing in their big truck was loading the items of a tent onto their truck, and that person was clearly not present. And we see that happen a lot. We see sweeps happen often when the resident is not there, either getting food, either at some human services, and they often come back and see their stuff completely gone.
Yeah.
You have a really sort of grim story in the piece. Maybe I'll just pull an excerpt here. His name was Rusnak. Is his last name? Rusnak attempted to access emergency shelters all over the city, but was often found they were at capacity. In December 2018, he was staying in a tent shelter in the city. A few days before Christmas, he stepped away from his home to run errands and returned to find everything he owned gone. His only forms of shelter, Christmas presents for his children, tools, clothing, and objects of deep personal importance. And he is now you say here, is now one of 3 unhoused plaintiffs in, I think, the lawsuit I think you mentioned that the ACLU has filed against the city. The suit, which was filed before the pandemic, argues that the city government has criminalized poverty and is punishing people for trying to live on city-owned land. And it also says that when the city sweeps an encampment, it disturbs a homeless person's private affairs and invades their only source of privacy and refuge, and that the city cannot do so without a warrant, which encampment removals do not have. So anyway, look at it. It's whether from the sort of civil rights legal angle, it's obviously that seems like a very reasonable argument that they should have a warrant to fuck with people's stuff. But I mean, you're just showing up and destroying the only tiny bit of a life that someone is trying to cling on to. I guess to beautify the neighborhood.
I mean, these are people's homes and shelters, even if they're temporary. And even the Ninth Circuit of the U.S. Federal courts has actually ruled that that these shelters, whether tents or vehicles, cannot be entered by police officers without a warrant. But the city is still conducting these removals. And also to point to the encampment they went to on the 18th, basically the city lied to direct service providers. Yeah, they lied to like shelters and other people, saying they'd already stopped planned sweeps, but here they are. They had at least 2 different scheduled sweeps they tried to do. One on the 11th that we wrote about that did go through, and then this other one on the 18th, and those are just ones we know of. But it's just ridiculous that the city is obscuring and lying and not telling the truth and not being straight up. And I think that's also a tactic to help continue their practices and not have to change anything.
Yeah.
The city council passed an ordinance where I think it was about a year ago, it became mandatory for the navigation team, FAS, HSD, all the departments involved in encampment removals to give weekly schedules to city council and let them know exactly what sweeps were happening. Of course, in fine print, it said only scheduled encampment removals. There's literally no way to know when these sweeps are happening anymore. Because, like we mentioned earlier in the podcast,
you can't put a non-scheduled on a schedule.
Exactly. You can't put a non-scheduled encampment removal on this mandatory. Exactly. And so I got lucky seeing the cops trying to remove this encampment in the sneakiest way possible. I'm talking to ACLU attorneys. I'm talking to housing advocates like Real Change. They literally don't know when these things are happening until it's over, unless you happen to be there.
Let's not even accidentally give the city too much credit here, because we've been talking about these sweeps that are happening after the 17th, after the city said, oh, in light of this crisis that's going on, we're obviously going to stop shuffling people out of the only homes they have just to punish them. And they announced that. And we've been talking about ways that the city has apparently still been trying to sweep people, at least on a few occasions here. But really, and I think a big part of the reporting in your piece here, let's not forget, is that it was still absolutely just policy, the same continuing policy that we have talked about, this despicable policy we've had for the last several years of clean and hold, sweeping people out of their camps, fencing them up, whatever, was still the policy for over 2 weeks after Jay Inslee declared a state of emergency. So, and I think you report here that as far as you could find, it seems like, or actually, I think you cite Erica Barnett with this, that they had done at least 15 sweeps between March 1st and March 17th. So the day after Inslee's state of emergency announcement, and about 2.5 weeks later. So that's bad enough as it is, right? That it took 2.5 weeks for the city to let go of this program that was already sort of this despicable and punitive thing. But I mean, what does that tell us about how important this is? I guess what's the question? Does this tell us more about how deeply ingrained this need to get rid of and punish these people is in sort of the mind of our political class and our leadership? Or is that more evidence of their just like fecklessness and incompetence and lack of imagination in the face of this current crisis? I mean, like, pick one.
Guy, you can pick.
Yeah, I don't think it's simply incompetence. I think it's they're still operating under a logic that sweeps are necessary in some way, and this is just completely and utterly wrong. And it's maybe similar to how people talk about how prisons are societally necessary. And so they can't admit it. As soon as they admit that they can just stop all sweeps, which they didn't actually do, even though they did halt the navigation team, then they basically betray the lie that these aren't necessary in the first place, and so displacing thousands of people every year is not necessary. And I mean, like, potentially putting people in danger or risk of death is not necessary. And so they're trying to circle the wagon here and say, oh, this is wrong. This is like a necessary evil, when it's not.
Well, they're saying like, we can't, put everybody in shelters now because crowding people together is worse for the pandemic, and rousing people from their tents is worse for the pandemic. So they're using that. They're really trying to stress that as the only reason that this has to stop, lest it be understood in the way that you just proposed, that actually we don't need to do this. Because if we don't do this, I think this is what they probably do understand. If they don't keep getting rid of people, then it's going to be a more consistently visible problem even than it is now in a lot of neighborhoods. And then obviously your white homeowner NIMBYs, next door people will be, up in arms and yelling at them about it. But it also will sort of, the more visible the problem is, the more it demands an actual solution that actually looks at the whole problem on a systematic level and says, like, okay, if the answer isn't sweeping people up and just hoping they disappear, like, what do we actually have to do?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as they keep throwing people away, then this is exactly like prison. Just like you said, they can, if you quote unquote throw people away, they'll disappear, which is just wrong.
Well, and I think too, using the police to do these roundups and stuff, it confers an air of legitimacy, right? The state is conferring an air of legitimacy for treating these people as subhuman, right? Even the term sweeps itself, these are trash to be swept away. And I think, part of the reason why we don't move towards housing, particularly now in this pandemic, is if they ever were to build housing for these people, what kind of message would that send? That these people are actual human beings, that housing is an actual human right? In a city ruled by real estate, who the fuck wants to hear that, right?
Definitely not. It's not good for their pamphlets. It's not. I mean, even when they do these one night counts, right? They're picking the season, the time of day where they're least likely to find an unhoused individual. They don't count people sleeping on steps at churches, etc. And so they're trying to mask this problem as much as they can. And it's the irony is that the numbers are still really blown up. But even the McKinsey study doesn't really show to the fullest what our problem is.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the same, consultancy group that advised Canadian grocers that they should engage in bread price fixing basically came down and told Seattle, like, you need 15,000 houses now and 30,000 houses in the near future, right, to solve this crisis. It really highlights the crisis that we're looking at. And I think, you talked about displacement at the beginning of the podcast of, populations that are, let's just say, easy to forget about, right? The Central District, if you were to ask or talk to anybody in the city about the Central District now, I think their main comment on it would be, what a hot real estate market.
Right.
Yeah. And that just seems to have been what's happened to the working class of Seattle, which is they were displaced and now it's a hot real estate market.
Guy, were you the one who told me Pete Buttigieg worked for the McKinsey study?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, he did.
He worked for a McKinsey and Company. So, I mean, they're not a great company. But even them, the fact that even these, like this consulting group that uses very neoliberal economics can reach the conclusion that there needs to be a lot more public housing shows just how cowardly the political class is in Seattle.
Yeah. Well, it shows. Well, they're answering the question, what would you have to do if you wanted to solve this problem? But I think what we see is like our political class and, the real estate interests and whoever else don't want to solve the problem. They want to make it go away they're comfortable doing that by labeling the most marginalized people in society as basically a criminal underclass. And I think that's, to maybe start taking this in a final direction here. Like we know, again, with homelessness, with all of this, we know like that part of the reason it's so easy to view people as this criminal underclass that society should respond to with the police that should be driven out is because we are talking about often the most marginalized groups in society. Where this is obviously it's poor people, but it's Black and brown people, indigenous people, in queer people, all in outsized numbers. The most marginalized people in society. This is how our society has dealt with it here in Seattle in terms of the homeless problem. But when we see that these are the groups that get hurt the most, but let's just talk about coronavirus now, because this is bigger than homelessness. Obviously, it's totally exacerbating this already massive wound we have here. But we don't have a health system that can handle this, and you can guess who's gonna get the worst of that. And I think we're actually starting to see statistics start to come out about the death rate. I don't think it would be surprise anyone to know that Black and brown people make up a larger portion of that than they do the population. We are heading into probably a massive economic depression. I fear this as a coming sort of genocide of the poor and marginalized people in this country, and I just would love to hear your thoughts on that from both of you. What do you see coming?
I mean, I want to start off by saying the unfortunate part of this whole thing is that we're not even going to be able to properly document all the death that happens within the unhoused communities linked to COVID-19. Because there's already a huge lack of resource and accessibility on unhoused folks getting access to things like tests and healthcare. And so we're going to see a larger number of homeless folks die and face health crisis. And a lot of it will be linked to this pandemic, but there's not going to be any records of that. And that's just going to be the unfortunate part, because it's another way for the city to brush it under the rug. And for them to just claim. Yeah, exactly. For the whole country.
I see us, in 5 10, 20 years, people will be arguing about the number of dead attributable to coronavirus, and most people will think it's way lower than it really is. And
Oh yeah.
people like us will be angry about that fact and like know that some huge number of people died, and it just that's the right is in power in this country, and it's our country's dysfunctional anyway.
well, Greg, to give you this idea of sort of what Greg's saying about, we'll argue about the death count. I was living in San Antonio when Hurricane Katrina happened, and I knew and helped fund a lot of people to go to New Orleans to do work there. And I remember them coming back and having talked to a lot of people in New Orleans and stuff, and asking, like, how many people did you think died? And their guess was, along the Gulf Coast, easily thousands. In New Orleans itself, hundreds, if not thousands. And I think the official death count for Katrina in New Orleans was like 60.
Jesus.
And for reasons that, like how houses were marked, you'd mark the house and you'd mark whether there was bodies in the house or not. There was more than 60 of those markings, like in a neighborhood. And so I think we just live in this world where they just tell you whatever, fuck it, who cares, right? 100 people died from corona, right? Who's going to ask, right? Nobody cares about these people. And I think that's especially grim, but I just can't see, especially with homeless people, it happening any different this time around.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should not undercount the scale of the crisis right now. And like you said, the people who are going to be most affected are those who are already affected by capitalism, racism, patriarchy, ableism, etc. And especially in-house people fall in that category. And so I think this is also an opportunity for social solidarity for people as individuals and in collective communities to kind of make a difference. Even small things are huge. Checking in with your friends and staying at home, socially distancing, contributing to mutual aid projects, like all these things will save lives. And so we need to also think about how we can respond. I think it can be very daunting and demotivating to consider the fact that we have a fascist like Trump in power, and the state, which is already so fucked up, has very incompetent and malicious actors running it. But that just underscores the importance of organizing digitally and with our communities to build power and to do these small actions which will save lives and hopefully shift towards the world we want to be living in.
Yeah, we can only hope. I think, important to recognize also, though, that like the right is also going to use this and they're in power. And so just on maybe a smaller scale, right here in Washington, the Inslee just line item vetoed a bunch of spending. I don't even really understand what it is that he took out of the budget, but because that's all we have. We have austerity. We don't understand economics in any other way. We know we're heading into a depression, so there's no help from the federal government. So Washington State gonna cut spending, and we're talking about, this is a supposedly progressive Democratic governor but this is all that's apparently available to him. This is all the imagination. This is all the fight, and he, egged on by the Seattle Times Ed Board a couple days earlier. This is great. Coronavirus requires painful cuts to Washington State budget. Oh, they're so sad that it's going to be painful. And they say in this, the Ed Board says, Inslee is expected to veto some new spending before signing the budget into law on Friday. He must not hold back. That requires political courage, but there's simply no choice. This is what we're up against, gang.
It's completely ridiculous.
Never let a good crisis go to waste, y'all.
Yeah. I think the left has historically been so much worse at exploiting sort of this shock doctrine, as Naomi Klein says. And so we need to organize, for example, Shama Sawant has been doing a lot of great work to push Jay Inslee and others towards the opposite direction, because austerity doesn't work. It screws over poor people and working class.
Right.
And so we need the politicians that are quote unquote more progressive to actually be accountable and do the right things.
It also
And I do want to
potentially- Yeah, go ahead.
Mhm. Sorry, I was just gonna say I do also want to shout out like the organizing groups that have been doing really good work on the ground,
Yeah, go.
collecting resources for under-resourced neighborhoods. COVID-19 mutual aid is one in particular I'm thinking of, that has grassroots activists but also healthcare workers trying to make sure that resources from the city and within communities are equally distributed, because we all know that doesn't always happen.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and I think, this idea of mutual aid, social solidarity, class solidarity, I mean, that's going to be more important than ever. Without any sort of rent freeze or anything, I mean, quite frankly, we're going to come out of this with a lot more homelessness. And I think the issue is, we talked earlier about, the police are told they can't go to the tents without a warrant. They do it anyways. The police are told not to sweep encampments. They do it anyways. And the reality is, laws, city regulations, all that's just words on paper. And without a countervailing force, there's nothing to stop these people from doing, to stop cops from doing what they want to do, right? There's nothing to stop real estate interests from using the cops to do what they want to do.
Mhm.
And really, class solidarity is going to be it. I mean, Day, you brought up the issue of should we just have people be squatting in buildings and taking over them? I think that's fucking great. And that'd be awesome if it happened. And if it happened, the rest of us who are housed need to be prepared to go down there for when the police go to mob that building to, actually defend it. Right.
Yeah.
And
we need to be organizing now.
That's the real deal.
We need to be organizing now so that when people can come together, they're ready to start shit.
And we're seeing it happen in Oakland. We're seeing it happen in other cities. We need to be taking their lead for sure.
Yeah, I think the squatting is a great thing. I mean, I would love to mob a downtown hotel and just demand of the management that they hand out all the room keys. Sounds great.
Yeah, maybe one of the balls.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. Well,
I heard their temperature is always like pristine.
Perfect place to set up a tent. Actually, under a tree in the balls.
If he wants his boys to swim, temperature's got to be controlled.
Oh my god! Imagine Bezos's face when he finds out one of his balls is overtaken. Holy shit!
Normal people get testicular cancer. Bezos, his balls get occupied.
Exactly. We should first bring his warehouse workers there.
Yeah.
Well, I bet he's sitting somewhere thinking to himself, "Gosh, I really wish I could let all the homeless people into the balls, and I wish I could just give away, billions of dollars of my wealth to help people, but that would set a precedent." And gosh, that would just be a moral hazard for the world to come to rely on my wealth that I created. I just try to imagine myself as a billionaire morally justifying my disgusting wealth. It's just a hobby of mine.
Yeah.
I mean, My Northwest is already reporting out stats like burglary is up 80% in downtown Seattle in the past couple of weeks. And joking aside, we've been saying for a long time that this class war happening in our city is going to reach a pressure point that's eventually going to blow up. And I'm not condoning violence or anything like that at all, but it's going to come to a point where the people being harassed, their tents destroyed, generators thrown away, swept every other week, they're either going to end up dying or they're going to end up having to push back. And I literally don't know what that looks like. And I think it's 4 weeks ago, before we're in shelter in place, to talk loosely about organizing a group of people to do a joint squatting effort, with the very high likelihood that we can help with their resistance and help keep them safe through this crisis. That seemed totally unrealistic. But I think right now, with everything that's going on, I think that is one of the more logical next steps to help our unhoused communities. And I think as we see more and more desperation continue to permeate in our city, things that we thought were out of reach suddenly becomes our only option moving forward.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, something's got to break at some point. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah.
We
how
got
are you
through
guys
the
holding
technical
up?
difficulties.
Yeah, we did.
Um,
We did. I blame the virus.
Yeah. 5G. It's 5G.
Exactly.
Well, listen, it's been super awesome to talk to you. Sorry we lost Colin, I guess. He had just everything went wrong in this
Sorry,
recording, but
Colin.
it's all good.
Sorry.
It'll turn out okay. And thank you so much for coming on. I mean, this is a really great conversation. Everyone should we'll link to it. We've tweeted it, but we'll tweet it again. We'll link to it in the description, and everyone should read this Nation article because there's a lot in there and a lot of really deep reporting that really sort of exposes a lot of specifics about sort of what has been going on. So
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
definitely
Yeah.
everybody check that out. Thanks again so much.
Thank you for having us.
Guy and Day. Stay safe and sane out there.
See you on the
You
boat.
too. See ya.
All right.
Yeah, I'll see you guys.